the spark that could end the world. There is a moment in every catastrophe when the world changes color before it changes shape. A second where the human mind cannot accept what the sky is doing. A second when daylight becomes something alien. Scientists call this moment the threshold of nuclear winter, a point where fire becomes climate and destruction becomes global. It is the slow, methodical shutting down of Earth. The lights dim, the warmth drains away, and the world begins to die in silence, not screams. But to understand how humanity could find itself on the edge of this abyss, we have to return to one morning in 1945, a morning that lasted less than a heartbeat, and yet cast a shadow 8 decades long. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a young clerk in Hiroshima stood on the steps of a bank, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. He didn't hear the approaching bomber. He didn't see the bomb falling. All he saw, just before his existence was erased, was a sphere of white light expanding faster than thought. The flash carved his silhouette into the stone like a photograph burned in reverse. His body evaporated, his shadow remained. A perfect outline of a life interrupted. Within seconds, wooden homes all across Hiroshima ignited. Roof tiles liquefied and dripped like molten wax. The heat fused sand into glass. Asphalt boiled. Windows exploded inward with enough force to turn shards into bullets. Human skin burned from the radiant heat alone. Then came the black rain, thick with soot, dust, and the pulverized remnants of everything that had existed a second before. That bomb released more energy than 15,000 tons of TNT. By today's standards, it was small. What happened that morning was not just the destruction of a city. It was the demonstration, on a tiny scale, of a mechanism capable of killing the world. Because a nuclear bomb is not merely a weapon, it is a spark. What follows the spark is the true horror. Modern nuclear weapons are designed not just to destroy, but to burn entire urban landscapes. A single detonation over a modern city would ignite firestorms beyond anything 1945 could produce. Towering cyclones of flame so hot they generate their own winds, pulling oxygen from miles around and feeding the inferno with everything combustible. Buildings, fuel reserves, forests, chemical storage facilities, vehicles, plastics, warehouses, power plants, human bodies, entire districts. All of it turns into soot, black carbon. And because the firestorm is so intensely hot, that soot doesn't stay near the ground. It rises with a force no natural wildfire can replicate, punched upward into the upper atmosphere like a volcanic eruption made of cities, climbing past the clouds, past the weather systems, and into the stratosphere. Once there, it stays. For years. For decades. This is what scientists fear. Not the explosions, not the shock waves, not the radiation, horrific as they are. Those kill millions. Nuclear winter kills billions. Nuclear winter kills the world. The first victims of a nuclear exchange are the ones closest to the blast zones. People vaporized instantly. People who disappear before they can register pain. Outside the radius of total annihilation come the next deaths. Those claimed by collapsing buildings, by fire, by shrapnel, by suffocation as firestorms consume all available oxygen. Hospitals burn, communications die, roads melt, entire neighborhoods vanish. But these are local tragedies. Nuclear winter is planetary. Most smoke from ordinary fires rises into the lower atmosphere and is washed away by rain within days. But nuclear smoke is forged in temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. It rises past the rain-bearing layer of the atmosphere into a region where nothing cleans it. No rain, no storms, no dilution. Instead, it forms a global shroud. Within days, sunlight dims around the world. At first it looks like overcast weather, dark clouds, a strange twilight at noon. Then it worsens. Sunlight fades to a weak, cold glow. The sky turns the color of bruised metal. Days and nights blend. Temperatures fall by 5 degrees, then 10. Then in some regions, 20 degrees below normal. Snow begins to fall in June. Frost cripples fields in Africa. Monsoons vanish. Seasons collapse. Plants struggle first. Without sunlight, photosynthesis falters. Crops begin dying in waves. Wheat, corn, soy, rice. Not gradually, but continually, season after season, because the sun never returns to full strength. Insects die next, then birds, then grazing animals. Livestock perishes in dark. Freezing barns without fuel. Oceans cool. Fisheries collapse. The biological web that supports human life unravels faster than any country can respond. And this collapse doesn't happen where the bombs fall. It happens everywhere. A child on a distant continent starves because a city burned on the other side of the planet. Who dies first in this global darkness? Surprisingly, the most technologically advanced nations. Countries dependent on imported food, Japan, the UK, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, run out of reserves within weeks. Urban centers, unable to heat themselves or distribute food, see mass deaths from cold before hunger even strikes. Medication expires. Insulin runs out. Kidney patients die in the thousands. Cancer treatments stop. Emergency rooms become morgues. Then energy collapses. Fuel stockpiles empty. Power grids fail. Governments lose control. Not because they refuse to govern, but because there is nothing left to govern. Civilization fades not in explosions, but in slow-motion suffocation. Still, some people survive. A tiny fraction. Perhaps 1% of humanity. Perhaps less. They survive not because they are the strongest, but because they are fortunate enough to live in the right combination of geography and isolation. Remote islands with fisheries, mountain villages, parts of New Zealand, certain regions of Australia, Iceland with its geothermal heat, small pockets of northern Canada, places with low population density, natural food sources, and access to clean water. But survival is not salvation. These survivors live in a world that feels like it has slipped back into the Ice Age. An age without megafauna, without ecosystems, without stability, without technology. A cold, dark post-human era. The terrifying irony is that Hiroshima often gives people the wrong impression. They look at the rebuilt city and imagine that nuclear war is survivable, that humanity can recover, that trees grow back, that life finds a way. But Hiroshima survived because only one bomb fell, because the world around it still functioned, because sunlight still reached the ground, because a global firestorm never ignited. The survivor trees of Hiroshima, ginkgos and camphors that sprouted from charred roots, are symbols of resilience, but also symbols of a narrow escape. They grew only because the rest of the planet still lived. In a full-scale nuclear exchange, there would be no light for them to reach toward. No pollinators, no seasons, no climate as we know it. The trees survive today because the world survived around them. In nuclear winter, it is the world that dies first. And as we look at modern arsenals, hundreds of warheads poised on submarines, silos, mobile launchers, bombers, we know something uncomfortable. The mechanisms that could trigger nuclear winter no longer require a world war. A regional conflict between two nuclear-armed states could be enough. A miscalculation, a false alarm, a panicked decision at 3 a.m. inside a military bunker. Humanity lives under an atmosphere that can be broken by fire. We learned this in 1945. We ignored it every year after. And as we step into the next chapter, the question becomes not what happens if nuclear winter begins, but how close we already are to the spark that could ignite it. Minutes from midnight. There is a moment late in the night, somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m., when the world is most vulnerable. The streets are empty, The phones are quiet, and even the brightest cities feel thin, as if the darkness has swallowed more than just light. It is in these hours that systems designed to protect humanity are at their weakest. Fatigue creeps in. Data glitches go unnoticed. Machines misread signals. Humans misinterpret shadows on their screens as missiles. More than once, the world has come within minutes of ending in its sleep. Every nuclear winter scenario begins not with an explosion, but with a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a moment of panic. And often, the first step toward oblivion is cloaked in routine. A radar alert, a phone ringing in a hardened bunker, a sudden blip on a satellite feed. What follows is not the launch of weapons, but the launch of decisions. Decisions made by tired men in cold rooms with fluorescent lights, who hold the future of the planet in their hands without ever seeing the sky they could erase. Scientists today know that a full nuclear winter does not require thousands of detonations. It does not require a world war. It requires fire. Enough fire to pump 50 to 150 million tons of soot into the stratosphere. Enough to dim the sun, cool the oceans, and starve the continents. And fire does not care whose flag is painted on the missile that sparked it. The most sobering truth is that even a limited nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, for example, could send the world into climate collapse. The weapons each country possesses are small compared to the megaton-class giants held by the United States and Russia, but their cities are enormous, dense, and filled with combustible material. If 100 to 150 warheads detonated over major population centers in South Asia, scientists estimate the resulting firestorms could loft more soot into the upper atmosphere than the entire Industrial Revolution produced in a century. Within weeks, global temperatures would plunge. China's wheat harvest would fail. Africa's monsoons would weaken. The American Midwest would freeze under an unfamiliar sky. A war that didn't involve the United States or Europe could kill millions of Americans and Europeans simply by extinguishing their food supply. This is the nature of nuclear winter. It does not care about borders, alliances, or intentions. It is the brutal arithmetic of climate. Multiply fire by cities, divide sunlight by smoke, subtract humanity. But to understand how quickly such a scenario could unfold, we have to travel from Hiroshima to the modern control rooms where the world's deadliest weapons now sleep. We have to step into the places where the future is quietly, constantly at risk. Deep beneath the American Midwest, in a bunker the size of a small room, a missileer sits with a steel key around his neck. The room is silent except for the hum of old equipment, machinery designed decades ago, maintained, updated, and kept alive like a relic that still breathes. The missileer knows the checklist by heart: authenticate the order, brace, insert keys, turn simultaneously. His counterpart across the room would do the same. 2 human hands, 2 metal keys. The simple physical act that could light the fuse of nuclear winter. Across the ocean, in a Russian early warning station near Moscow, an officer watches a screen filled with dots and lines and symbols, satellites, weather anomalies, space debris, ground reflections. The system is fast, but not perfect. It has warned of imaginary attacks before. It could do so again. The officer's job is not to trust the machine, but to interpret it. And sometimes, the line between caution and catastrophe is razor thin. In a submarine missile compartment, hundreds of meters underwater, sailors move through green-lit corridors, where each hatch leads to a weapon capable of ending a civilization. Submarine crews are trained to operate without contact with the outside world for months. If communication is lost, they are taught to assume the worst. A cut cable, a satellite failure, a storm in the ionosphere. Any of these could be mistaken for a destroyed homeland. And in the eerie silence of the deep ocean, a single wrong assumption could trigger annihilation. This is the paradox of nuclear deterrence. The systems built to prevent war are the same systems that could start one. Yet even these razor-edge risks pale in comparison to the physics that lies behind the next step. What happens when cities burn? Imagine the first hours after a modern nuclear exchange. The explosions have ended. The shock waves have passed. The firestorms roar, dragging everything flammable into their vortex. And then the smoke begins to rise. Black, oily, thick, hotter than molten metal, carrying with it the chemical signatures of an entire civilization being vaporized. Plastics, asphalt, synthetic adhesives, fuel reserves, industrial solvents, microchips, wiring, clothes, building insulation, the countless petroleum-derived materials that define modern life. This isn't smoke from a forest fire. It is smoke from a technological society disintegrating in heat. And that smoke has properties humanity has never fully confronted. Computer models show that soot from a nuclear firestorm absorbs sunlight with brutal efficiency. It heats up like metal under a furnace and climbs higher and higher until it reaches the stratosphere. Because it is black and fine and aerodynamic, it can travel on upper-level winds for months before slowly spreading into a thin, uniform veil around the planet. And once the sunlight is blocked, even by a fraction, the Earth begins to drift into a new state. A colder state, a darker state. A state that does not sustain the systems humanity depends on. For the first week after the initial detonations, most governments would still believe recovery was possible. The shock and panic would be extreme, but the long-term consequences wouldn't yet be visible. Radios would continue broadcasting emergency instructions. People would be told to stay indoors, avoid fallout zones, ration food. Military leaders on all sides would try to assess whether more attacks were coming. But within 10 to 15 days, the sky would begin to change. Sunlight would dim even on continents untouched by the conflict. Noon would resemble late dusk. Plants would slow their growth almost immediately, as if confused by the loss of energy. Solar panels, critical for powering emergency infrastructure, would lose efficiency. The temperature drop would begin quietly, almost gently, as though autumn had arrived out of season. Then, the first crop failures would appear. Wheat and corn are resilient, but they cannot grow without light. Even a 10% reduction in sunlight sustained over months would cripple the world's agricultural systems. In the worst-case scenarios modeled by experts, global crop yields could fall by 50 to 80%. Regions that rely on imported grain would face starvation within months. Nations with stockpiles would find those stockpiles shrinking rapidly, as desperate populations consumed emergency reserves. Governments would attempt to restore order, but the loss of sunlight would create a cascade of failures. Fuel supplies would dwindle, power grids would collapse, transportation networks would disintegrate, food distribution centers would be overwhelmed. Refugees would move in waves across borders, searching for regions that remained warm enough to sustain life. Conflicts would erupt over arable land, clean water, and dwindling energy reserves. The chilling reality is that the majority of deaths in a nuclear winter scenario would not come from radiation or blasts, but from hunger and cold. Billions of people today live in regions that cannot feed themselves without global trade. Once trade collapses, those populations would face the full force of climate-driven famine. In wealthier countries, initial survival might be higher, but long-term prospects might be no better. Medical systems would collapse. Antibiotics would run out. Chronic illnesses would become death sentences. Psychological stress and the breakdown of social order would take their own toll. Entire cities, New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, would become uninhabitable, frozen monuments to a world that vanished in a single night of fire. And yet, some would endure. Survival would hinge on geography. Remote regions far from nuclear targets, islands with fisheries, mountain communities with access to clean water. Nations like New Zealand or Iceland, where geothermal heat could warm greenhouses, even in the absence of sunlight. might preserve small pockets of civilization, some parts of Australia, some regions of Patagonia, certain Canadian valleys, but their survival would not resemble the world we know. It would be a world of subsistence, scarcity, and caution, a world where every newborn child represents both hope and risk. Civilization, as we understand it, would not survive. But humanity might, in fragments, in cold, scattered enclaves. This possibility, the survival of some, is the only thread of hope in the otherwise bleak scientific consensus. But even that sliver of hope is fragile. Models show that if soot levels in the atmosphere exceed certain thresholds, the climate could take not a decade but centuries to recover. Oceans could remain cold. Rain patterns could stay broken. Species extinctions could accumulate. Ecosystems might never fully return. Humanity would become a shadow species, haunted by its own fire. And the most agonizing truth is that the spark that begins all of this might be smaller than anyone imagines. Not 1,000 warhead exchange, not a global conflict, but one mistake, one misread radar signal, one failed communication link, one violent escalation in a regional war, one human moment of fear. This is the world we live in, a planet suspended between fire and shadow, where the technologies meant to protect us have created the conditions for our extinction. And as the world sleeps through its most vulnerable hours, the question grows louder. How long can humanity balance on the edge of night before one small spark makes the sky go out? How many will die in the dark? Civilization does not disappear in a flash. It disappears in layers, like a photograph burning from the edges inward. The explosions are only the ignition. What follows is slower, colder, wider. A collapse not of cities, but of systems. A collapse that begins with the sky and ends with the species that once believed it ruled the planet. Scientists call this chain of events global systemic failure. Survivors, if any remain, will call it something simpler: the end. In the first days after a nuclear exchange, the world will still resemble itself, if only by inertia. Governments will issue statements, allies will reassure each other. Stock markets, for a brief, surreal moment, might still attempt to open. But the mechanisms of global function, transportation, trade, energy, agriculture, are already dying. Not from radiation, not from shock waves, but from something no nation can escape: the diminishing sun. Once nuclear soot ascends into the stratosphere, it forms a planetary shroud. Within a week, sunlight is reduced by 10%. Temperatures fall by 2 degrees C. To most people, it seems like an oddly cold spell. But in laboratories and military weather stations, the first calculations begin, and they are terrifying. When the soot layer stabilizes, sunlight will drop by 30 to 60%, global temperatures by 10 to 20 degrees C, and precipitation by up to 45%. The world's climate system, finely tuned by millions of years of evolution, will enter what researchers describe as forced regression, a rapid decline into an artificial winter resembling the last ice age. This is the moment when civilization begins to unravel on a global scale. The first failures occur in the food system. Agricultural scientists know that even a 10% drop in light can reduce yields dramatically, but in nuclear winter models, yields collapse entirely. Within 30 days, wheat growth slows to a halt. Corn fails within 40 days. Soy, rice, barley, potatoes, every staple crop humanity depends on, enters what botanists call light starvation. Photosynthesis recedes, leaves yellow, plants die, not in one region, but everywhere. By the end of the second month, global food production falls by 60%. By the fourth month, by 80%. No country has storage capable of replacing that loss. And yet the true catastrophe is not hunger itself. It is the cascade that hunger triggers. Without agriculture, economies collapse, Without economies, energy systems fail. Without energy, water systems shut down. Without water, millions die in cities untouched by bombs. As the shroud thickens, temperatures continue to plunge. Snow falls across continents in months where snow has not been seen in millennia. The Amazon, long imagined as eternal, begins shedding its leaves. The monsoons in South Asia fail. The Sahel dries into lifeless dust. Fishermen in the North Atlantic pull up nets filled with cold, empty water. Humanity, for the first time since its creation, faces a planet withdrawing its permission for life. But the collapse does not strike everywhere at once. Some regions fall faster, some slower. Geography becomes destiny, and the world fractures into fates divided by latitude, climate, and chance. North America is among the first to descend. The United States, once a breadbasket of wheat, soy, and corn, sees its fields freeze. Iowa loses its harvest entirely. Kansas becomes tundra. Texas cotton dies in frost. California's orchards drop fruit prematurely, then go silent. Between 300 and 350 million people live in cities that depend on long-distance food supply chains. Once those chains break, hunger spreads with a speed that shocks even emergency planners. The power grid, already fragile, collapses under the strain of cold and fuel shortages. Snow falls in Florida. The Mississippi River freezes in some stretches. Canada, colder still, becomes largely uninhabitable outside a few coastal pockets. Europe suffers differently but just as brutally. Food imports stop almost immediately. The North Sea winds intensify, bringing sub-zero storms across Britain and France. Germany's forests die in waves. Spain becomes a barren plateau of frost. Italy, once warm and fertile, sees olive trees freeze like glass sculptures. Russia, with its vast cold expanses, fares worst. The southern grain regions freeze, the northern regions become inaccessible wastelands. Gas pipelines fail. Refugees move west, but the borders are closed. Thousands freeze at the edges of nations that can no longer help. Asia faces catastrophe at a scale unmatched in human history. China, with 1.4 billion people, watches as its rice fields darken and die. The Yangtze Valley, the heart of its agriculture, freezes. Food reserves last weeks, not months. Millions begin to move south in search of warmth that no longer exists. India sees its wheat belt collapse, its cattle die, its rivers shrink. Japan's cities survive the longest thanks to infrastructure, but their food lines stretch for miles. Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia face famine first, not because they are the poorest, but because they are the most densely populated. Africa's tragedy is shaped by the sky. When the monsoons fail, crops wither. Rain-fed agriculture, the continent's lifeline, ends. Temperatures plunge in places that have never known cold. Livestock dies in the first winter. Nations that depend on imports have nothing to import. Starvation spreads faster than aid can be imagined. South America suffers less at first. Brazil's tropical warmth offers temporary resilience, but soon even the rainforest loses its green. Argentina and Chile, with their mountains and fisheries, hold out longer. But without global trade, without fertilizers, without machines, they too begin to starve. The Andes become a place of refuge, but also a place of grief. Australia and New Zealand become the quiet outliers. Their isolation, their rainfall patterns, their fisheries, their small populations, these factors buy them time. New Zealand's geothermal energy allows indoor farming to continue in limited amounts. Tasmania, Patagonia, Iceland, these places become the last islands of stability in a drowning world. But stability does not equal safety. They face waves of refugees, internal tension, dwindling supplies, and winters that last longer every year. Yet even in these collapsing continents, numbers tell the story more clearly than words ever could. In the first 3 months, deaths from blasts, fires, and radiation total 80 to 120 million worldwide. But famine and cold quickly overtake them. By the end of month 3, an additional 500 million die, mostly in Asia and Africa, of starvation, exposure, dehydration, and untreated disease. By the end of the first year, the numbers swell beyond comprehension. Food systems have collapsed in every region above 20° in latitude. Cities like New York, London, Beijing, and Seoul become ghostly ruins filled with cold, silent towers. Between 2 and 3 billion people die from hunger alone. Another 100 million from disease. Tens of millions more from violence, migration, and regional conflicts born out of desperation. By year 2, temperatures have stabilized at 10 to 15 degrees below pre-war averages. Oceans remain cold. Fish stocks crash. Agriculture is non-functional. The human species enters what demographers call rapid depopulation collapse. Another 2 billion perish. Civilization, as defined by urban living, international trade, medicine, electricity, and government function, ceases entirely. By year 5, the world is nearly unrecognizable. The sky is permanently dim. Snow lies on equatorial mountains year-round. Even the survivors struggle to understand the scale of what happened. Where once lived 8 billion humans, fewer than 500 million remain, a population size last seen in the 1500s. Many live in tiny, scattered communities without technology, without fuel, without industry. Some regions collapse entirely into uninhabited cold deserts. Others adapt, slowly, painfully, with the knowledge that the global civilization they inherited has vanished forever. The percentage of humanity that survives, the final echo of a vanished world, is between 5% and 8%, according to most nuclear winter models. And only a fraction of those survivors will live long enough to rebuild anything resembling a society. The rest will be custodians of memory in a world that has forgotten warmth. But the hardest truth is not in the numbers. It is in the realization that civilization dies not when buildings fall, not when governments collapse, not when the last satellite goes dark. Civilization dies when the sky no longer supports life, when the sun itself becomes an enemy, when humanity learns too late that a species dependent on warmth cannot survive a world it turned cold. Civilization does not vanish in smoke. It vanishes in shadow, and the shadow lasts longer than the fire. Who fires? First, in every era, there is a quiet fear that runs beneath the noise of politics, diplomacy, and war. It is the fear that somewhere, in a sealed room beneath concrete and steel, a decision is being shaped that could end humanity. Not by malice, not by strategy, but by miscalculation, pride, or panic. The world today is closer to nuclear conflict than at any time since the Cold War. Not because nations seek extinction, but because their arsenals are designed to function in the dark, at high speed, with little human hesitation. The truth is uncomfortable, and scientists admit it with increasing urgency. A nuclear war in the 21st century is not only possible, it is plausible. Not from one moment of madness, but from a chain of ordinary decisions that lead, step by step, into catastrophe. The story of who might strike first is not a question of villainy, but of doctrine, geography, and systems built to react faster than human judgment can think. Modern nuclear planning operates under the concept of first-mover advantage. It is a simple but terrifying equation. The side that launches first has a better chance of surviving, even if survival means only hours longer. The United States, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, France, and the United Kingdom all know this. All have war plans crafted for the possibility that the enemy will strike without warning. The most dangerous moment is not when leaders want war, but when they fear they are about to lose one. In Moscow, inside a command bunker buried beneath layers of concrete, The world's largest nuclear arsenal sits on constant alert. Russia's doctrine, revised after 2014, allows for the first use of nuclear weapons if the state feels its conventional defenses are failing. This doctrine, escalate to de-escalate, is built on the belief that a limited nuclear strike can shock an adversary into retreat. It is not a strategy of annihilation, but of leverage. Yet every scientist who studies nuclear winter knows the truth. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Fire does not negotiate. Across the ocean, American planners prepare for scenarios in which Russia, China, or North Korea might strike first. The United States maintains nuclear submarines, intercontinental missiles, and stealth bombers, all designed to retaliate instantly. It was built on the logic of mutual destruction, of ensuring that no enemy could disarm America with a single surprise attack. But to guarantee retaliation, America keeps a portion of its arsenal on launch on warning, meaning missiles could fly within minutes of satellites detecting incoming warheads. The system depends on satellites, sensors, radar, and software working perfectly. History shows they do not. In 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov sat in a bunker watching a screen report that 5 American missiles were on their way toward Russia. He was instructed to authorize a retaliatory strike. Petrov hesitated. Something felt wrong. He refused to trust the machine. Hours later, it was confirmed. The missiles never existed. A satellite had misread the sun's reflection on clouds. One man, by intuition alone, prevented the world from ending. In 1995, Russia mistook a Norwegian weather rocket for a U.S. submarine-launched nuclear strike. President Yeltsin opened the nuclear briefcase. The world came within minutes of an irreversible chain reaction. Only last-minute verification saved civilization. These moments are not anomalies. They are warnings. The systems that guard humanity are fragile, fallible, and aging. Some computers in American missile silos still run on 8-inch floppy disks. Some Russian early warning satellites suffer periods of blindness due to orbits that leave gaps in coverage. China and India are building new nuclear platforms faster than they can build the command structures to safely control them. Pakistan's warheads, designed for battlefield use, sit dangerously close to active conflict zones. North Korea's arsenal grows each year with no long-term command and control infrastructure at all. These vulnerabilities make the world's nuclear map a mosaic of hair triggers. Consider the United States and China. Their competition is growing across oceans, technologies, and economies. China once maintained a small deterrent force, enough to survive a first strike and retaliate. Today, it is expanding rapidly. New silos, new submarines, new mobile launchers. American analysts estimate China could possess 1,000 warheads by 2030. China's new doctrine hints at early strategic warning, a euphemism suggesting Beijing may consider launch on warning as well. A single radar anomaly could trigger panic on both sides. India and Pakistan, locked in a decades-long rivalry, hold another flashpoint. Their nuclear weapons sit on mobile launchers minutes from their border. Their early warning systems are incomplete. Their political tensions can escalate from skirmish to airstrike within hours. Scientists warn that even 100 regional detonations could trigger nuclear winter. India and Pakistan together possess more than twice that number. Israel sits in a region where existential fears shape every military calculation. Iran pursues nuclear capability in a region already thick with tension. North Korea's arsenal grows larger and more sophisticated each year, with missiles capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. South Korea and Japan debate whether to acquire their own nuclear deterrents. In every scenario, the path to the first strike is not a madman pressing a button, but a system responding to stress. Military conflict, political miscalculation, technological failure, cyber interference. or a moment when leaders believe their options are running out. The world today is a network of alliances and rivalries, more complex than at any point in history. A single crisis in the Baltic, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, or the Kashmir border could ignite a chain reaction. Every weapons test, every military exercise, every misinterpreted signal is a thread that could unravel everything. The most dangerous truth is this: nuclear weapons are built on the assumption that rational actors control them. But crises are not rational. Humans under pressure do not think like humans in peace. Leaders are influenced by incomplete information, political pressure, pride, fear, and the belief that showing weakness could cost them their nation. Computers are influenced by clouds, cosmic rays, software bugs, and systems designed in a world that no longer exists. The question, who strikes first, is not answered by morality or intention. It is answered by doctrine, by fear, by misunderstanding, by algorithms, by machines interpreting data that humans cannot verify in time. Russia might strike first if it believes NATO is preparing a decapitation strike. The United States might strike first if satellites detect what appears to be a mass launch. China might strike first if it believes its nuclear silos are being targeted in a preemptive attack. India or Pakistan might strike first if one misinterprets the other's mobilization. North Korea might strike first if it believes regime collapse is imminent. Israel might strike first if it believes Iran is nearing nuclear capability. In every case, the spark comes not from confidence but from fear. This is why scientists say the world today lives in the second nuclear age, an era defined not by superpowers, but by instability, by regional rivals with short decision times, by automated systems that react faster than diplomacy, by doctrines that imagine small nuclear wars can be contained, by leaders who grew up in a world so accustomed to peace that they do not truly understand what hangs above them. The present reality is stark. There are more pathways to nuclear war today than at any time since the invention of the bomb. Every new war, every new miscommunication, every cyber attack near a military system increases the chance of a mistake. No nation wants nuclear winter, but every nuclear nation has built systems capable of starting it in minutes. The final irony is that the power to end the world does not lie in the hands of presidents, generals, or dictators alone. It lies in machinery, in sensors, in automated warnings, in the fragile relationship between human judgment and technological speed. Civilization is not threatened by evil. It is threatened by the thin line between caution and catastrophe. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, humanity lives in the shadow of a question that grows darker every year. What happens when the next false alarm doesn't look like a mistake,